Hello everyone. The next topic that we are going to discuss is cells. Obviously this is a really important part of our course in biology, since as we look at cells we know that they are that basic building block of life. So I wanted to go back for just a few minutes and remind us about a couple of things regarding our hierarchy. If you remember, we've covered a lot of our chemistry already with looking at the structure of atoms and how those atoms build into molecules. And as we continue to move forward now, we're landing here at this level here with cells. And one of the things that's unique about these cells is that as we progress from atom to the cellular level, this is the first level that we get to that's considered to be alive. So all of those properties or characteristics of life that we talked about before now are true of this level, and also as we move forward into tissues and organs and organisms, of course. So as we talk about cells here at this level and this unit, obviously we'll have to come back one step here and talk about some of the organelles, some of the machinery that cells have inside of them that explain why our cells are alive and how they're able to do the things that they do. One of the first things that I wanted to address here as we look at this cellular level is to talk a little bit about the cell theory. Remember what a theory is when we talk about the theory, that word. We're talking about something that is well accepted in science, that has been tested over many experiments from many different scientists. So let's take a look at what we know about the cell theory so far. First of all, we know that the cell theory tells us that all living things are composed of one or more cells. So some organisms are just a single cell, like when we look at many bacteria, for example. Even though they can live in groups, the single unit of life there is that one-celled bacteria. And there are even some protists that are going to exist as just a single cell, like an algae. There's one celled algae. There's also going to be amoebas. They're a single cell, a paramecium. However, most of the life that you're familiar with are going to be composed of more than one cell. So anything that you can see with the naked eye is obviously going to have millions of cells that are going to make it up. So that's one of the first parts of our cell theory, is that all living things are made of these cells. The second part of our cell theory is that our cells are the basic unit of life. When we're looking at those things that are alive and we break it down to its smallest level of things that are still living, then we're here at this cellular level. So obviously there's something really unique about cells and how they function, and then when we start to put them together with other cells, boy, we can get a lot of new properties emerging. Finally, the piece that I want to leave us with the cell theory is, well, where do cells come from, right? We know that all new cells are going to come from existing cells. If we just think about how life gets started, let's think about you, right? You started off with a sperm cell from dad, and that cell united with an egg cell from mom. So just want to make sure that we're clear that this sperm is a cell, a living cell, and so was this egg cell, a living cell. It wasn't just a combination of biological molecules. It wasn't just a combination of atoms. It was actually cells joining together, and then that formed a zygote, which we know is going to grow into the adult organism. And I think we've talked about that before. So these are the most important components here of our cell theory, and something I wanted to make sure that we talked about. All right, well, as we start to move into cells, one of the first things we will do as we make our way through all of our different types of cells to study is to look at the diversity that we had. So you have a great picture in your textbook, and I wanted to show you this. And then I'm going to have some activities for us to do here later on that's going to help us look at even more diversity. These are just three examples of the types of cells we might see across the world. This first panel right here are cells actually taken from a human, and they are from the nasal passages. So lining your nasal passages, you have some cells, and this would be an example of what many cells look like in that area. The second panel that we have here actually is from a plant. It's from an onion, and what you'll notice about this onion is how different the cells are shaped. In many cases, they're a lot more like a rectangle. Plants tend to have more of a square, rectangle look to them, and these even have some triangle shapes at the end. And then you can actually see really clearly here the nuclei. Those are the nucleus of the cells. And they're pretty obvious when we look at them inside of the onion. So that's another example. And then finally, we've got some examples of bacterial cells. So you'll notice that we've got cells in this particular panel that are bacteria. And these bacterial cells are actually from what's called Vibrio. And so they're interacting actually with other cells as well as we look at them. So lots of diversity when we look at cells with regard to their shapes, in regard to the types of machinery that make them up, as well as their size. So let's take a look at all of the different types of things that we could look at underneath the microscope and make some comparisons. One of the things that I think is challenging when we start to look at things under the microscope is that we assume that everything under the microscope is just small and that it's all the same size in its smallness, and that's not true at all. If we actually were to take a look at a scale and compare a few different things, this gives us an idea of how things, even at this really small microscopic level, there's a huge range of things that are slightly larger to slightly smaller. So let's start with those things that you could see with the naked eye, right? Certainly you could see a person and you can see a chicken egg or an ostrich egg. And then we start to get down to a frog egg, which you still can see with the naked eye. However, as we start to move this direction and start to look at things smaller and smaller, we're then getting to things that we can't see necessarily with the naked eye. We'll notice here at this important level that we'll address quite a lot here, that we have a plant and animal cells. So most of the cells that we have would fall into this range. Even within our own human body, we have some cells that are a little smaller, and then we have some cells that are a little larger, like this right here is a human egg, which is slightly bigger actually than many of our other cells, whereas maybe one of your red blood cells actually is a little bit smaller on average. Plant and animal cells then tend to be about the same size compared to everything else that we see here. What we also notice is that bacterial cells are going to be much smaller than either plant or animal cells. So here we can see bacteria, and you'll notice that they're much smaller. Then here we can see, for comparison, an organelle that's present inside of a cell. And so here are the mitochondria. This mitochondria right here is actually referring to that organelle right there. It's also present in the plant cell right there. And so you'll notice that it's gotten very small, down to 1 micron. Viruses are even smaller than bacteria, and our viruses aren't even considered to be alive, so we're now getting down to the subcellular level. If we look at proteins, one of those organic molecules, same with lipids, and then we've talked about a number of atoms like carbon or oxygen, nitrogen, or hydrogen, those big 4 that are the most important. We can see that that's the smallest on our scale here. So recognize that we can see some things with the naked eye, and then for a number of these things we're going to require microscopes. We will be doing a lab on microscopy. I'm going to be letting you use an online virtual microscope. And one of the things I want to stress about that is that we will be using a light microscope. These would be really similar to ones that you could use in a laboratory in high school. If you did that, if you were to take the on-ground lab, you would use a light microscope in the lab. And you would be able to see plant cells and animal cells and even bacterial cells really nicely with that light microscope. However, an electron microscope is not something that we have a lot of in this area. Probably just the largest universities in our area will have an electron microscope. So it's not possible really for us normally to be able to see things like viruses, proteins, lipids, and atoms, because it simply requires something so powerful to be able to do that. If we were to go out into the world and try to look at all of the different cells that are out there, we'd actually make our first categorization of cells based on whether or not they were prokaryotic cells or eukaryotic cells. So I wanted to take just a minute so that we are clear about the difference. We're going to learn a lot more about details of each of these, but if we just compare them, how are they different from one another? And if you remember back to some of the domains that we talked about early on, I hope this will be a little bit of a review for us. But whenever we look at these words here, that the definitions of these roots will help us. If we take a look at this word right here, pro, this is going to mean before. And if we take a look at this root u, this means true. So those are the terms that are different from each of these. What's similar for each of these terms, though, is this root karyotic. And karyotic is referring to nucleus, an important structure that we have inside of some cells. So prokaryotic cells are essentially before the nucleus. These are cells that do not contain a nucleus, so there's no nucleus present. And in addition to that, they don't have any what we call membrane-bound organelles. No membrane-bound organelles. So some of the machinery inside of the cells are quite different. You know prokaryotic cells as bacteria. So prokaryotic cells here are bacteria, and they're in two domains. One is the domain bacteria, and then prokaryotic cells are also in that other domain, archaea. So we will talk a little bit later about some of the structures that we see here between present in our prokaryotic cells and between those in our eukaryotic cells. But if you look at the eukaryotic cells, we remember that they are going to be present in the domain eukarya. The domain eukarya. And they're going to be present in many of the kingdoms that are there as well, of course, since they're contained within that domain. So that's going to be the animal kingdom, Animalia, those are eukaryotic cells. Our plant kingdom, Plantae. Our fungus, and then finally, not necessarily a kingdom, it's usually many kingdoms of a group called Protists, which include algae and both single-celled algae as well as large algae and some other things as well. So the picture that I have here is actually from the plant kingdom. So this comparison picture is from a plant cell. You know that because it's a little bit more square than round, and also because they have some characteristics that are typically unique to plants, like chloroplast, for example. And we'll get to all of those a little bit later. Eukaryotic cells, because they have a true nucleus, then have a nucleus. And so here it is. We can see here this nucleus is going to contain the DNA of the cell. And so animals and plants and fungus and protists will all have a nucleus, and that's really what that eukaryotic means. There are other structures here, the presence of membrane-bound organelles here in our eukaryotic cell that we don't have in our prokaryotic cell. And just some examples of the membrane-bound organelles would be the Golgi apparatus, the mitochondria, the peroxisomes, our chloroplast, which we've already circled, and the endoplasmic reticulum. So we're going to talk more about these membrane-bound organelles and their specific functions because obviously as we move into more detail, animal plants are different from plants, from fungus, and from protists, but some of these will be common to all of those as well. We want to make comparisons between these prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells as we go. And so I wanted to point out to you a chart that's in your course manual that is really similar to something that you have in your textbook. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar. And so I would encourage you to fill this out as we go. We're going to touch on a couple of these right now, and then as we come back to looking at eukaryotic plant and animal cells, we'll continue on with that. But hopefully what we noticed when we were looking at our prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells are some things that they have in common. And so I did want to point out a few of those similarities. One of the first things that is present in every single life form that is named slightly differently in these two pictures is the presence of a membrane. This picture over here with our prokaryotic cells is calling it a cell membrane. Over here in our eukaryotic cell, it's calling it a plasma membrane. We'll call it a plasma membrane in both, or cell membrane in both. You can use those terms interchangeably. And so this is something that's very key for all living organisms to have, because this is something that's going to help those cells be able to maintain a boundary. So we want to note that all cells, yes, will have a plasma membrane present in all three. And this boundary really helps that cell do one of those fundamental life functions, which we know is going to be maintaining homeostasis. This is going to prevent anything from just moving in and out of the cell randomly, and instead anything that moves out of the cell or into the cell is going to have to be moving with some regulation. So that's one of the things that we'll see present. Something else that's going to be present in both, while it isn't necessarily labeled here on both, are the contents of the cell. And so those contents of the cell is what we call the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is just going to be including anything that's on the inside of the cell. And there's also going to be cytoplasm on the inside of our prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Another structure that is present in all cells, shared between all cells, are going to be ribosomes. So ribosomes are here in our prokaryotic cell, and we also have ribosomes here. Ribosomes are really small. They're shown as these small dots. And the function of these ribosomes are the same in prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. And their job is to make or synthesize, the fancy word for make, proteins. All cells have to be able to make proteins. So if we continue to fill out our chart here, we know that prokaryotic cells as well as eukaryotic cells are going to have cytoplasm, so we'll check that off. And we know also that ribosomes are going to be present in all three, and that their job is to synthesize proteins. We've just mentioned that. All right, a couple of other distinctions that I want to make between the two, where we start to now see some differences, is the nucleoid versus the nucleus. So remember that just inherent in their definitions here, our prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. What we see instead is their genetic material right here, all of the sort of brown squiggly lines here. They do have DNA. That's their genetic material, but it's not contained within a nucleus. And instead, it's just going to be in a region of the cell called the nucleoid. So the nucleoid is just the region where the DNA is located inside of the bacterial cell. Whereas the nucleus in the eukaryotic cells is a contained structure. It actually has a membrane around it, and it's going to contain the DNA, which they're referring to here as chromatin. That's going to be roughly the same as our DNA, and so it's going to be contained in that nucleus. So that's an important distinction that we have between our prokaryotic cells and our eukaryotic cells, is that our prokaryotic cells will have a nucleoid, but that's not present in our eukaryotic animals or plants. Whereas our plants and animals will have a true nucleus, but there's not a nucleoid area that's going to be present there. This gives us an idea of some of the initial differences that we have between these two cells. Some of the other activities and animations that you'll be watching in the Wiley Plus Learning Space are going to talk about some of these other organelles and give you some more detail about some of the functions of these structures. So I'd encourage you to continue to fill out this chart in your course manual as you go through those activities.